Well, thank you, Walter, and it's a delight to be here with an old friend. And of course, I think we have standing room only because in 48 hours or so, I think Newt's life and Callista started to change a bit. So there's a growing interest in the vice presidential vetting process. And I'd like to start by quoting, to set the stage for everyone, John Adams, serving as the first vice president, said about the role, "In this I am nothing, but I may be everything." Grace Coolidge, on the other hand, told her husband Calvin when he was offered the vice presidency, "You're not going to take it, are you?" And he said, "I suppose I have to." What are you going to say to Callista when Donald Trump calls and offers it to you?
I'm going to say, do you remember what Grace Coolidge advised her husband? I mean, this would be a first of all, there's a lot of speculation. None of you should bet, as a friend of mine did on Fox last night, Karen Tumulty, who's a political reporter at the Post, bet all $100 of her phony money that I would be chosen, and then wrote me a note and said, with my track record of betting, you are now guaranteed not to be the choice. So none of you should bet on all this. It's wild speculation. I suspect if it did come to anything, we'd have to have a very, very long talk, and then depending on that talk, Callista and I'd have to sit down with Donald and have another long talk.
Well, we'll get into a little bit, if we will, of what you see as the vice presidential role. But I want to go back a bit and set the scene about you. In the 1980s, I had the privilege of knowing you when you were a younger congressman on the Hill. And we called you the C-SPAN baby, because in 1979, you may recall, C-SPAN started to cover the House of Representatives. And you had the most fabulous platform, because you also had something to say. In the beginning of that C-SPAN coverage, you were smart, you had bold ideas. I think then it was called the Opportunity Society, and we were in the Reagan administration trying to have tax reform and regulatory reform and help people. Amazing. And that became ultimately, I guess, grew into the Contract of America for America in the 90s. But Arthur Brooks, in his book, The Conservative Heart, pointed out that he went to you when he became in a leadership role, because he had admired your leadership role on the Hill when you were evolving into a majority Republican Party. And he was interested in your wisdom as a leader. And he was surprised when you said that your biggest problem wasn't the press or the media. It wasn't even a calcitrant president. It was the minority attitude of the now majority Republican Party in the House. Can you talk about that a bit? Because the majority Republican Party in the House today may be disappointing people. And as vice president, could you help repair that with your knowledge of the Hill?
Yeah, I think just a couple of quick anecdotes. When Phil Gramm switched parties, he'd been a Democrat and he became a Republican. And a very, very bright PhD in economics professor. I sat on the back bench with him one afternoon and I said, so what's the real difference between majority and minority? And he said, you know, when you're in the majority, you have to have an idea. You then have to have hearings to shape the idea into a bill. You then have to write the bill. You then have to go through markup in subcommittee and committee. You then have to go to the floor. Then you have to go to conference with the Senate. And at every stage, it's evolving and you're trying to get enough votes and it's constant work. He said when you're in the minority, you wake up occasionally, vote no, and go back to sleep. And that captured the great crisis of the modern Republican Party. And people don't understand this. I was very fortunate. I came along at a time when I could study under Reagan and the one House Republican who understood being a majority, and that's Jack Kemp. And both Kemp, of course, was a total outcast in the Republican Party because he was a football quarterback, he was weird, he kept doing tax stuff and he wasn't on the tax committee. His next door neighbor, Barbara Conable, who was the ranking Republican on taxes, hated the fact that Kemp got all the publicity on taxes when Conable should get the publicity, although Conable, of course, being a good Republican, didn't want any publicity. And so I studied under Kemp and Reagan. Now, Reagan was an FDR Democrat who became a Republican partly over communism and partly over taxes. and the big impact that Nancy and her father had on him in terms of he became much more conservative after 1947. But the driving force there was having actually encountered communism and concluded that it was real. So Reagan had his natural FDR model of course you're going to govern. Well, if you're going to govern, you have to figure out what does the country need, what does the country want, how do you solve it, and how do you communicate it so the country will give you permission? And then when they give you permission, how do you implement it? Well, those are all very positive but hard things to do. The other person I was fortunate enough to study was Margaret Thatcher, who, if you ever want to see, a brilliant small work, is a book by Claire Berlinski on Margaret Thatcher. I think it's entitled There Is No Alternative, Why Margaret Thatcher Matters. It's an absolutely brilliant book that explains the core of Thatcherism. And just to add some fuel to the fire here, I would argue that Trump is much closer to Thatcher than he is to Reagan. In that Thatcher was a genuine revolutionary. And she knew she was a revolutionary, and she was determined to break socialism, and she was determined to break the power of the coal miners' union, which had become so strong, it directly threatened representative democracy. And so she saw herself as a Churchillian figure, engaged head on in fundamentally changing Britain, and she largely succeeded, not totally, but largely. Reagan was in many ways totally focused on defeating the Soviet Empire, and at the margins, moving America back towards more free enterprise, less regulation. But he did not see himself as a person whose mission was to profoundly overhaul Washington. So I think that's just another thing. So I look at what they're doing, and I think they have a couple problems. One is, if you're a conservative, you have to get up every morning understanding that the news media will largely oppose you, at least 80%. And therefore, you have to design your policies so when they get done opposing you, you're still winning. I mean, it doesn't do you any good to get up and whine. You know, if the news media intimidates you, become a liberal. Then they'll like you. But if you're genuinely conservative, so for example, when I first got elected, and a lot of things in politics don't change. The Time and Newsweek stories the week before we took control for the first time in 40 years. At a moment, by the way, of enormous disbelief in the media, none of whom thought we'd win. Literally none. You can go back and look at the video. None. The week before, the title of the cover of both covers, by accident, was Angry White Men. Nothing changes. You know, after I've been in office 3 weeks, I'm sorry, after the election, but before I was sworn in, Time did a cover story of me as Scrooge holding Tiny Tim's broken crutch. Wasn't enough to steal it, I broke it. Entitled, How Mean Will Gingrich's America Be to the Poor? Question mark, which proved it was nonpartisan. Because it was a question mark. I mean, they weren't rendering judgment. The following week, Newsweek had me as a Dr. Seuss figure entitled, The Grinch That Stole Christmas. Now, this was the entry point, and explains a lot of my early polling numbers. But here's what the middle class got. Oh, he's for welfare reform. They went right past every effort by liberal reporters in New York to make me look bad and said, oh, he's for welfare reform. Okay. We became the first re-elected majority since 1928. I mean, people have talked to me about how much damage did closing the government do? None. It's all Washington mythology. Nobody had been re-elected as a House Republican majority since 1928. And we got re-elected because we were ferociously conservative. We were willing to fight on things like welfare reform. But here's the point. If you're a conservative, you had better pick 70% plus issues. Well, welfare reform actually, at its peak, was a 92% issue. Even 88% of people on welfare thought it ought to be changed. Well, at a 92% issue, when the New York Times and CBS News and everybody else gets done tearing you down, you drop to 60 or 65%. You pick a 52% issue, you'll get killed. So one of the tricks for conservative leadership is always find fights where you inherently have a very large majority going in. And always frame the fights in terms of a better America, and always describe it in personal terms. Those are the lessons of Ronald Reagan.
Let me pick up on that then, and to the role of vice president, particularly if you had the role. We go from Contract for America Opportunity Society to Paul Ryan and his agenda. Could you, as vice president, be an influence on President Trump and have a merger, if you will, with Paul Ryan and the agenda there, and help repeat what you experienced that you've just described in a majority House and hopefully a majority Senate?
Well, I mean, first of all, if somebody became vice president, I think that Vice President Biden would confirm this later on today, the number one definition of the vice president's job is the president.
Right.
So who knows? I mean, some presidents give a lot of power to vice presidents. Lyndon Johnson had 2.5 years of misery because the Kennedy staff and Bobby Kennedy didn't like him. So they isolated him, which of course led to a certain payback when he became president. So, I mean, you've got to look at different, Dan Quayle had a limited
and
role.
I'm trying to push you a little into what you think from your conversations, perhaps, with
I haven't had
Mr.
any
Trump.
conversations about this.
All right.
I mean, I have no idea. My working assumption is, and again, Cliff and I have to talk a lot of this out in detail because it really messes up your life. I mean, you're going on, we have a lot of fun things we're doing. We're about to launch a movie on women in the American Revolution, and we're doing a bunch of other things. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, no, why don't you go over there? So I have a very simple test question. If it's about funerals, I'm not interested.
Gotcha.
Okay?
But if
Now,
it's about a merger,
if it's
if
about
I
an
can call
ability
it
to
that,
try to get things
yeah.
done, and at least Trump has said over and over, he needs a vice president who understands
government.
Washington because he knows he doesn't. Well, if he really means that, and who knows? But if he really means that, because again, people often maneuver a lot. I'm just finishing a book called Those Angry Days, which is a brilliant study of FDR from 39 to 42. And you watch FDR maneuver every morning, and I mean, you have no way of knowing what he's doing because he's deliberately deceitful and deliberately maneuvering and very frightened because he lost the Supreme Court fight, and he was very frightened that he would lose popular opinion. So in terms of leading from behind, he liked to be about 35 points behind where the public was. And it's fast. So I just say that because people think, oh, Trump doesn't quite know what he's doing. Well, go read FDR. I mean, all of these guys shift around and change, as Obama did on a whole range of issues.
Well,
so I start with the idea, you'd have to look at how you're going to put it together. You're going to have to look at what the real relations are with the senior staff. Because again, you always have the tension between the chief of staff. If you had a strong vice president, then you got to work out what's the arrangement here, so that the chief of staff isn't so threatened that they spend all day, trying to screw you up. The other thing I'd say though, and I've tried to say this to Ryan and others, we need to go back to the constitutional system. Now I'm going to tell you a brief anecdote about Jimmy Carter and Tip O'Neill, but it illustrates the point. Ryan and McConnell have enormous leverage. I mean, McConnell's in a position, let's assume for a second, which many of you will find horrifying, that Trump wins. The first thing Trump's got to think about is, gee, I'd like to appoint a cabinet. The first person you have to talk to about appointing the cabinet is the Senate Majority Leader. And so if McConnell and he are not dancing, he has a huge problem. He's going to want a whole number of things that pass the House and Senate. The total power of scheduling, except in the most rare of circumstances, is the Speaker. I mean, in that sense, it's a terrific job. I mean, you have complete power. And so if Paul Ryan decides he doesn't like what Trump is doing, he has a simple, you don't have to fight him. It just won't get scheduled. So here's my anecdote, which I've told Paul, because I'm trying to get him to understand. This is not like dealing with Obama, which is a different problem with a different, if you have a president of your own party, so it's 1981. Jimmy Carter has won as an outsider. His entire team is from Atlanta. None of them understand anything about Washington. They arrive. Hamilton Jordan is his chief of staff. Staff member comes into O'Neill's office and says, by the way, your family's been given really bad seats at the inaugural. Because, of course, all the Georgians got all the good seats. O'Neill picks up the phone, calls the White House and says, could you connect me to Hannibal Jerkin? And a minute later, Hamilton Jordan comes on and he says, is this Hannibal Jerkin? He said, well, sir, this is Hamilton Jordan. He said, well, Hannibal, I have been told that my family has really bad seats. And I want you to understand that I realize the new president, one, is a reformer, and I realize that you all don't have any great respect for the United States Congress, and I appreciate the sincerity of your positions. I also do want you to understand that I am the host for the inaugural, and that you have every right to give my family bad seats. Of course, as a result of that, nothing you want will be scheduled for the first year. And he hangs up. 20 minutes later, his staffer comes in and says, "Do you know your family's now in the first row?" It ain't about friendship. The Constitution's designed to balance power so that people don't have to like each other, but they had better learn to work with each other.
All right, so whether vice president or outside advisor or advising whomever is vice president, is Ryan's leadership of the House and McConnell of the Senate going to hold in this next election, meaning do we keep the majority? And two, is it your advice, thought that you can be helpful no matter where you are, given your experience?
I'd really like to do what I did in the George W. Bush administration, and that's just be an outside advisor. I mean,
that worked.
You get a chance to pick your targets, go work on the things you want to, and I did it both on defense and intelligence and on healthcare, and I think I had some contribution to make, and it doesn't totally screw up your life. First of all, we'll keep the House. I mean, it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which we lose the House, partly because the districts that we hold are the districts where Hillary is the least popular. So when you look at national data, she may be coming out of downtown Los Angeles right now with, say, 80% of the vote. But she's not coming out of Darrell Iss's district with 80% of the vote. And so the whole nature of how the geography works overstates the Democrats for president and overstates the Republicans for the House of Representatives. So barring some really unforeseen thing, the odds are overwhelming that Ryan will be Speaker and that the Republicans will keep their majority. They currently have the largest majority since 1928, which is one of John Boehner's accomplishments for which he did not get much credit. But they kept growing this majority. And remember, when we took over in 94, it was a genuine revolution in that from 94 to today, the Democrats have only held the House for 4 years. So, I mean, we have fundamentally shifted power in Washington. It hasn't been used very effectively, but we have shifted it. And then phase two is going to be learning how to use it. The Senate, I think, is close, but I think it may not. I don't think the Senate is in trouble in the end, but that's because I have a theory of the election. And my theory of the election is, if I can just take you around the world for a second, the Prime Minister, or the President of Brazil is being impeached, and the person who's replacing her is under criminal investigation. And they have a scandal in which their nationalized oil company, the Bernie Sanders model of production, has been involved in a $40 billion bribery scandal. That's billion, not million. By the way, 74, according to Gallup, where I'm proud to tell all of you I am a senior scientist, 74% of Brazilians believe there's widespread corruption after a $40 billion scandal. 75% of Americans think there's widespread corruption. We actually have there's deep feeling in this country about how corrupt the system has become. Second, Venezuela's government is disintegrating in what is the most underreported major event of our times. I mean, it's really staggering how much Venezuela is collapsing. Now let's look at elections. The Austrians had a hardline anti-immigrant candidate who was opposed by a Green who was a pro-immigrant candidate. The third candidate in the race was a woman independent, and the two parties which have dominated Austria for 50 years came in fourth and fifth for president. The hardline anti-immigrant candidate won the election on election day until the mail ballots came in, and then lost the election by 31,000 votes. And yesterday, the court threw out the election because the establishment had stolen over 60,000 mail order votes. So they'll have another election. Now, that's Austria.
And likely someone more to the right has a real chance there.
Well, I think very likely the guy who probably won last time is probably stronger now because of things like Bangladesh and Turkey and you name it. Second, In Italy, Rome, for the first time in 2,800 years, has a female mayor. She was elected on the ticket of the Five Star Movement, which was founded by a comedian as an anti-corruption movement. She got 67% of the vote against the incumbent prime minister's party. And in Turin, another woman on the Five Star Movement got a similar result. In Brexit, of course, the entire establishment told the British people, you'll be stupid if you leave. They said, that's really cool, and they left. And the vote's very skewed. Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Gibraltar were very against leaving. England and Wales were much bigger margins. The final 52-48 is diluted, so England and Wales were much more in favor of leaving. And it was mostly, I think, not over immigration. It was mostly over Brussels bureaucracy. I mean, now 70% of the rules in Britain now are set in Brussels. And they were about to propose abolishing high-energy tea kettles, for example. I mean, stuff we just sit back and think, this is the kind of mindless stuff that leads people to rebellion. In Iceland last Sunday, the president, having had to resign because the Panama law firm disclosures indicated he had taken money out of the country during a financial crisis, not illegally, but he had taken money out of the country. So the president resigns. They have an election, special election. The history teacher who comes in first at 39% had never run for office. The businesswoman who came in second at 27% had never run for office. So they're back up between them to about the 66, 67% range. And the leading professional politician, former prime minister, got 13%. Now these patterns are building. The Australian election yesterday is a muddle, not as clear, but you see the rise of a whole series of one of the fringe parties is called One Nation. They may be getting 20% of the vote in conservative precincts. And so the Australian election is drifting in the same direction. I just give you that pattern to suggest the following principle. Everything the Clinton campaign is doing to suppress Trump will, in the short run, suppress Trump because he's not trying. She wants to spend $32 million in key states. She's going to look much better next week in the polls in those key states. It has no meaning. And the thing she's got to worry about is if he is still alive as a candidate on the 1st of October, and people do here what they've done in every country I described to you, they're going to say no. And the question is which one they say no to. And so she's got to find a way to make him so utterly unacceptable. And she can do that with the elites. But I'm not sure she can do it with normal people. And that's a real problem. And I will cite to all of you a remarkable book by Charlie Murray called Coming Apart, which is a study of what's happened to white America. And his initial chapters explaining the rise of the modern elite are worth all of you reading and thinking deeply about, because it explains how big the division is getting. Remember, 25 million Americans have dropped out of middle-class status in the last 10 years. Now, how do you think that 25 million feels? How likely are they to vote for the old order? And Trump's job is, frankly, to quit screwing up, get the election down to 3 or 4 big issues, all of which come down to a single concept: enough.
You mentioned Brexit, and I think some, even here at Ideas sessions, mentioned that Thatcher probably would have handled it differently because she would have heard the people earlier and started to develop a new relationship with Brussels. I would guess, because of the title of this session, Brexit, Sanders, and Trump, that Sanders and Trump are hearing the people. Can the new administration, if it's Trump, react fast enough to satisfy that populism that is clearly a movement, not a new party, but are the people you just described? And is that even possible in our government?
Yeah, by the way, I'm not sure that Thatcher would have been much more militant in dealing with Brussels.
Right.
But there are 27 other countries.
True.
And there's the Brussels bureaucracy.
But
And I'm not sure she'd have gotten anywhere. I don't know that she'd have gotten much further than Cameron. She just would have been more argumentative.
would she have solved the tea kettle problem? In other words,
No,
the British problem.
I think in the end she would have probably led the Brexit movement. I think she would have tried very hard. She would have said to the people in Brussels, you don't fix this, we're leaving.
But it's analogous, the point is,
Yeah.
this is all analogous
It's very
to
analogous
this
to here.
worldwide.
And I would just make one of, because I knew we were going to talk a little bit about Sanders. Here's the thing I find fascinating. Sanders actually represents a parallel phenomenon to Trump, with the exception that Sanders actually represents a continuation of the movements which have been underway. So we've been moving towards more and more government health care. He'd take it all the way. We've been moving towards more and more subsidization of college. He would take it all the way. We've been gradually getting more open about drugs. He would take it all the way. But Sanders doesn't represent a disruption. He represents an acceleration. And he did much better than I thought he would, partially a tribute to what's happened on campuses, where we've had 2 generations now of people being taught left-wing values, partly because if you go on to a large, these campuses are now huge, so you go on to a major college campus and you say, look, I'm going to give you free college, legalize marijuana, and you can be happy for the 23 years it'll take you to graduate. What is there to oppose in that campaign theme? So Sanders is appealing to people who are alienated from the establishment, but he's actually appealing within a framework that has been growing now at least since the mid to late 60s. Trump is very different. Trump is and I think there's a good reason why you have people who are so offended by him and so angry about him. I mean, some of it's personality, but that's not the core of this. I mean, if Trump had a very smooth personality, he is still fundamentally breaking up the core principles around which the Republican Party, at least since 1989, has built a general direction. And I think, and he's doing it with the level of populist energy that you have to have. This is the great conundrum. When you look at great populist leaders, and I always tell people, to understand Trump, assume that he is 1 part Andrew Jackson as a disruptor, 1 part Theodore Roosevelt with manic energy, and 1 part P.T. Barnum with constant selling. That blend of those 3 explains sort of the Trumpian phenomenon. And that, frankly, is fairly offensive. I mean, if you're part of an establishment which goes to think tanks and comes to Aspen and has conversations appropriate for corporate boardrooms, guys who talk at 4th grade levels and speak in the language of a good working class bar just drive you crazy. And if they succeed, they really drive you crazy because they disrupt everything you thought you invested your life in.
It was said that Reagan's, I think it's his nomination speech the first time around, he used the word people 89 times. That seems to be missing in the dialogue, except maybe with Bernie and Trump, to your point. And yet at the same time, go back to John Adams again, he was wary of politicians. He felt they became corrupted. Therefore, we needed moral authority and leadership and character. And I think some would say aspirational leadership and vision. I think that you gave in the House, what we were talking about earlier. Yet we have 2 candidates in Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump, who moral leadership and character may not be the first words on the tip of our tongue. What is that populist movement going to excuse that? Or they seem to so far.
Well, look, I think each side has a big excuse. Okay. No, I mean,
Yeah,
it's, analytically. I mean,
Yeah.
no matter what Clinton does, and no matter what her husband does, and no matter what the appearances are, and no matter how many news reports there are, the fact is, if you belong either to the left ideologically, or you belong to a group who gets money from government, you will excuse virtually anything because the alternative to her is unacceptable.
Point.
Okay, and so, you know, it's going to be virtually impossible to peel away below about 39%, because that 39% has such an overwhelming investment in not the other. Similarly, on the other side, if you're in absolute rebellion and you think that immigration has been a disaster, and you think that the wars in the Middle East have been a disaster, and you think that being driven out of the middle class by economic policies that have crushed you have been a disaster, and you are really mad about Washington corruption, and you really want change, and this is why everybody who beat up on Trump in the spring, remember, beating up on Trump by the Clintons is not a new experience for Trump. He had 16 opponents, plus the news media, plus Mitt Romney. I mean, all of these people spent all spring trying to figure out how to attack him. And I mean, as many of you know, I'm on Fox as an analyst. And so I kept trying, and I also write 2 newsletters a week, brief commercial at GingrishProductions.com, which you can get if you want. And so I really, as an intellectual, as a historian, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I first started doing this, Calista and I watched the very first debate in August of last year, where Trump got in this brawl with Megyn Kelly. It was the second time I thought that he was totally off base. The first was when he attacked John McCain, which I thought was crazy. He went up after attacking McCain. He then went up after the fight. And I watched that night. Everybody who was an analyst said Donald Trump lost tonight. Frank Luntz did this focus group of people. And this was the first time I began to realize the weakness of the Luntz model, which is all these people are watching each other, so they're queuing off each other as a group. And they were unanimous, Trump had lost. And then Twitter, Facebook, other online polls, 65 to 70%. Now, out of 16 candidates, 65 to 70, or 17, 65 to 70% said Trump won. Well, as a historian, I stopped and I said, wait a second. If the entire elite is over here, and 65 to 70% of the American people who are watching, and again, these are largely skew Republican, but who are watching the debate are over here, there is a gap beginning to build that's astonishing. So I began to actually study what he was doing, which I had not done up to. We know Donald, and we hung out with him occasionally, but I didn't think of him as the guy who was going to win the nomination. And what I began to realize was it's a very on the Republican side, not the Democrat. It's a very binary question that dominated the entire nomination. The people who are sick and tired of Washington don't want somebody who can manage the table better. They want somebody who will kick the table over. So people like Jeb Bush and Chris Christie and John Kasich show up and they go, I have great government experience. And for that block of the Republican Party, they said, got it, not you. Cruz came along and survived longer because Cruz is a brilliant Princeton-trained debater with Harvard law degree who knows how to make a great case on the theory of how one would kick over the table as a general idea described in a philosophical manner appropriate to Heritage Foundation. And so all the right-wingers are going, well, and this is the great tragedy of Cruz. All the right-wingers are going, you know, as compared to these guys who actually ran government, you're at least disruptive and you have a good story. And as Christie would get, as Cruz would get 2/3 of the way through describing this, Trump would walk in the room, kick over the table. And so they're looking at this big guy physically who just kicked over the table, which is what they want. And this other guy who was describing what it would be like if somebody actually kicked over the table. And from that point on, they couldn't catch him. And it didn't matter how you hit him. You said, oh, you had companies went bankrupt. Yeah, but he'll kick over the table. You've switched your positions 273 times since Tuesday. Yeah, but he'll kick over the table. Now, that may only be enough to get him to 40%, but he did beat 16 people. Last observation. I read these news media accounts, which I find just stunningly lacking in self-awareness. And they go, last week Hillary Clinton spent $23 million on advertising and Donald Trump spent $0. Yes, you could have done that about Jeb Bush and Donald Trump every week until Jeb dropped out. So it tells you nothing. Because she is out raising the money in order to buy the ads because she won't meet with the press, because she can't stand the questioning. Trump, meanwhile, is not buying the ads or raising the money because he's cheerfully hanging out with the press, who are so into him that even when he beats them up and says, look, I know you're really a liar, but I'll take this one question. And the reporter goes, oh, thank you. That's so nice of you. You have to wonder. Well, one last piece of this, because how many of you watched Donald Trump the night of the Florida primary when he gave us the Trump steak, Trump water, Trump wine? How many? Raise your hand, be honest, okay?
It's amazing.
I would never, ever theoretically have believed that Hillary Clinton could give a victory speech and have no network cover her live. Because Trump was playing with the networks. He was going, I wonder how many really stupid things I can do and keep them watching. And he knew one key thing. Any network which broke would lose half their audience in 3 minutes.
That's right.
And so he's there just messing around. You go back and watch it. It is one of the most amazing examples of just playing around with the heads of the networks I've ever seen. And he knew what he was doing. He wasn't doing it as a self-indulgent thing. It was an experiment.
Well, I think even the head of CBS said they put him on because it was about money.
Exactly.
That's what people watch.
Which is what his career's been about.
That's right. So, let me ask you, with the kick over the table scenario, and obviously all we know about Trump, are we going to rebuild a party, Republican Party, and I would argue the Democrats probably have to do a little repair too, and what will that look like? Do we need new systems, new process, new whatever, or were we, you know, and this leads into, will the mainstream establishment Republicans stay home, vote for Hillary, or will there be something emerging from the convention? So all this kick over the table is going to come to roost.
I think it'll be split. I think you're going to get a fairly substantial number will go back to Trump in the end because there's Hillary.
Right,
And the Supreme Court in particular drives them that way.
Yeah.
A significant number will stay home, or they'll write in somebody's name. And then a minority, but a significant minority who'll get huge press coverage, will endorse Hillary, as Brent Scowcroft did the other day, and Secretary Paulson did. But again, when you have, this is actually partly a validation of the scale of change Trump represents. By 1936, Al Smith, who'd been governor of New York, Democratic nominee for president, leaves Roosevelt because he's decided the New Deal's too liberal. I mean, you know, these are real changes. I would argue that Jefferson annihilating the Federalists, Jackson breaking up the national establishment, Lincoln creating a new party, and Lincoln and the larger group creating a new party, and William Jennings Bryan defeating the Grover Cleveland Gold Democrats are examples, and then Goldwater and Reagan breaking the old establishment. These are examples of the kind of thing you're watching. Trump, like him, dislike him, he got more votes than anybody else has ever gotten as a Republican. People can say, yeah, there were more votes against him. That's true. There were 16 people running against him. I mean, he got 13.5 million votes. Well, in our culture, there is a certain authority that comes with that fact. I mean, he will be nominated. The convention will be a circus. I have no idea what it'll be like. They turned down my idea, which was to have him come in on Thursday night riding an elephant. They said no. So I've already felt rejected, and I don't know what that. But it'll all be different. That's all I can tell you.
We'll go to questions in a minute, but I'd be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to talk about recent news. We have an attorney general meeting on a tarmac with a person under investigation. We have a Benghazi report that was positioned as just a lot of reports, but a 300-page Democratic reaction with surrogates and talking points, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a free trade attack, and I was always wondering whatever happened to free trade. So in the 3 or 4 minutes before we take questions, let's cover it.
I was going to say, that was we'll get to questions soon, but first we're going to have an 1,100-page dissertation.
That's right.
Okay, let me try to run through fairly
I know
quickly.
you have a view on
On
those.
Benghazi, let me just say, I've only read the opening of it, but a friend sent me, Jake Tapper at ABC, not ABC now, at CNN, has apparently put together a really good timeline walking through what happened that consolidates it all. And I have great respect for Tapper, whose book, The Outpost, is a remarkable case study of American courage and strategic stupidity combined into one event in Afghanistan. So Tapper, that's all I need to say about Benghazi. The meeting is more complicated. If you assume that it was Bill Clinton who wanted the meeting, then you have to ask, did he want the meeting in order to throw up enough doubt that you'd get to an independent counsel so that they could postpone everything until after the election? Did he want the meeting because he was his usual carefree, totally irresponsible self and had no idea that it fit into a larger context, like his wife being investigated? And he was feeling lonely that day, and he's always liked Loretta Lynch, and he thought, oh, why not? I mean, nobody would think anything was wrong if we got together, because after all, I'm Bill Clinton, and how could you think I would do anything inappropriate? I mean, you don't know. On the other hand, somebody suggested to me this morning, when you're together for 30 minutes, was it also a chance for her to brief him before the FBI saw his wife this morning? So all I can say is it had one useful thing if she meant it, and that is if she actually allows Comey to make the decision. I think that at that point, I mean, they're now in a no-win environment where I think the pressures are just unbelievable. If I were Hillary, I'd have been pretty mad because it gave her 4 more days of being reminded about the scandals.
I was going to ask, what do you think she said to him when he got home last night?
Probably nothing. I think whatever she would have said to him, she said about 20 years ago, and she has given up saying things to him. That's my guess. I mean, it's, you know, I told Calista, I used to have a dog named Kathleen's Pride of Riley after my mother. We got it at Fort Riley. It was a Doberman Pinscher. And I spent the summer of my senior year in high school trying to teach Pride how to read. And went reasonably well. We got her up to comics by late August. But I realized one day she didn't like to read, and she loved chasing rabbits, and I really liked to read. So we swapped roles. She went back to chasing rabbits, I went back to reading. And ever since, I've been in moments of, you don't want to try to teach Pride how to read with various people who you can't fix. Trying to get Bill Clinton to be responsible is comparable to teaching Pride how to read. It is just utterly impossible. It's just who he is. He's one of the most charming people I've ever known. He's astonishingly brilliant, and there's a screw loose. You know, and it's just unfortunate because in many ways he's a remarkable leader.
Maybe we'll get to free trade when we get questions, but I think we go ahead, Stuart, and then Pamela.
A microphone is coming your way.
You talked about 90% of the American people want to see something done about gun control. Ryan gets up and talks about civil liberties. As a loyal, longtime Republican, I'm embarrassed.
Okay, I don't think that was a question.
How do you explain that?
How do I explain it?
The Republican position, the Republican Party's position on assault weapons, that you can't get on an airplane, but you can...
Well, okay, to just take that example, the no-fly list is absurd. You go through the no-fly list, there are people on the no-fly list who shouldn't be there. The list is made up by a bunch of bureaucrats who kludge it together. So, if you want to say that there's an adjudication process where you can defend yourself, and if we conclude you're genuinely dangerous, you can't have a gun, that's fine. We've already done that under some circumstances. We've said if you're a convicted felon, you can't have a gun. We've said if you have mental illness, you can't have a gun. I'm perfectly happy to say potential terrorists fit that. Then I would ask you, so tell me how you're going to know they're potential terrorists, particularly because I suspect you don't believe in any kind of profiling. And you certainly wouldn't want to take a guy who said, I love ISIS, I'm glad that they knocked down the World Trade Center, I really hope that we were able to destroy Israel, but is that enough? You know, and so I would say, look, I'm in favor of a very big national debate about what we're going to have to do to defend ourselves. And my undergraduate alma mater just lost 2 students in Bangladesh, Emory University. And we need to understand, we're in a worldwide war. So I'm very happy to talk about how to simultaneously preserve the Second Amendment, which, by the way, has nothing to do with deer hunting. I mean, when I get friends who say, well, it's all right to have a gun for ducks. It's not why the Founding Fathers wrote it. The Founding Fathers wrote it because without bearing arms, they would never have won their independence. If those farmers at Lexington and Concord had not had weapons, we would have been crushed by the British. And they did it as it's a very political amendment. And it basically says, look, you don't trust the government, which is what the Founding Fathers collectively believed. I mean, they were inventing the Constitution, but none of them trusted the government because they all assumed that power tended to corrupt, long before Lord Acton said it.
Pamela. And then we'll have another one in the back in 1 minute. Oops, sorry.
You make a very compelling argument about kicking over the table. If it happens in January, Trump is president, the things he talks about, the trade agreements, the wall, immigration, etc., are they possible? Will they happen? What does he need to make them happen? Or this is just rhetoric?
Well, I mean, there are different pieces to that. Is it possible to win a general election in September and October in which there are 4 or 5 big issues and the American people by a large margin say yes? I mean, if that happens, then you have exactly what Reagan had and frankly exactly what Obama had. I mean, when the American people move, their political leaders tend to follow him. And he would need that kind of win in order to get the kind of things he wants. The other thing we didn't talk about is, if you end up with a Trump presidency, you should just study Madison, Wisconsin. Because any serious effort to reform the federal government means you have to reform the civil service rules. Any effort to reform the civil service rules is going to put 500,000 people in the streets. I mean, the government employee unions are going to go crazy. And if you assert the right to fire Veterans Administration civil servants who are corrupt, dishonest, and criminal, those being 3 of the characteristics that you have to worry about, the federal employees unions defend them. They just defended a woman in Puerto Rico in the VA who had pled guilty to armed robbery on the grounds that her 2 immediate superiors included a guy who had been convicted of sex offenses and a guy who had been convicted of drugs, and therefore, if they were both convicted and had a job, they had to put in the 3rd convict or it would be discrimination. That's the union position. Now you try to change that, it's going to be exactly like Madison, where Scott Walker had death threats. They had 100,000 people in the street. They had people occupying the Capitol for 6 months. And this is something the country's got to understand. You want to change Washington? You can change it. It'll be a real fight because the people on the other side will see it as the end of their way of life. In terms of the fence, if you've been to Israel, you know fences work. If you've been to Hungary, we were just in Budapest last week, fences work. The fact is, people don't like to talk about it. Ronald Reagan in 1986 signs the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which I voted for, which created amnesty. We were told 300,000 became 3 million. He writes in his diary, I am signing this because we have to have a worker system for employers and we have to control the border. So when Donald Trump says, I want to control the border, he's not exactly breaking with Ronald Reagan. And nobody else has a good plan for controlling the border, and no serious person believes that Clinton would do anything serious to control the border.
Pamela.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this conversation. It's really great. The beginning of your conversation, you said that if you were asked to be VP, you would have a long conversation with Donald Trump. What would we hear if you had that conversation? We were a fly on the wall. And what would you need to hear from him in order to accept that position?
Well, I mean, my concerns are pretty straightforward. I think that we need very dramatic, very deep reform. And I've spent my entire life since I was between my freshman and sophomore years in high school. My dad was a career soldier for 27 years. So I spent my entire life since August of 1958 trying to understand 3 things. What do we have to do to survive? How do you explain it to the American people, give you permission, and how do you implement it? We have a system which is very sick. I mean, you look at the VA and you look at the total failure, it is a case study in embarrassing incompetence. You look at the generation that won World War II, they got more done in a weekend than most of our bureaucracies can get done in a year. And it's because we're so muscle-bound with incompetence and regulations. So I would be very interested in working with somebody who was deadly serious in a disciplined way about doing this. And that's a conversation that would be necessary. I also, we have a lot of personal things. I mean, frankly, we have a terrific life right now. And the idea of, you actually have to work. I mean, ask Biden. I mean, being vice president means, you got to go to meetings. I mean, you got to sit around. You got to deal with the press all the time. You have to deal with congressmen. I used to be a congressman. I know what it's like to deal with congressmen. I don't know that I want to spend the next 4 or 8 years of my life dealing with congressmen. I think I'd rather read books and write books and make movies.
So if not you, who?
There are lots of good people. I'm not, then you get all these various examples. I mean, what is it? Chris Cillizza in the Post today has Christie, Fallon, Pence, Sessions,
But are they reformers?
I don't know. I'm not sure that's my job.
Okay, just want to try. Go ahead, right here, and then back there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Nia Evans. I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts of the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in the 2016 election?
That's a good one.
I actually don't know, to be honest. I can tell you that my advice to Trump, which has been pretty clear, and I've said it publicly, is to place a fairly large part of the campaign in August and September in the black community. I think that one of the great tragedies in American life is that we have allowed institutions to decay in ways that cripple human beings, and the Democrats can't reform them, and the Republicans don't have the guts to go and try. And I think that a Trump who would go to Southside Chicago and go to inner city Baltimore and go to inner city Detroit and talk clearly and candidly about the fact that we have adopted, we have 50 years of failure. I mean, we have 91% of the kids in the Detroit schools aren't learning how to read. Now, how are they going to have a decent future? People want to talk about income inequality. If you don't reform the schools, you can't possibly affect income inequality. How can we live in a country where there's an entire neighborhood in Baltimore that's a war zone, and where you have people getting killed every weekend in Chicago, and we shrug? So I think a Republican, we recently, and I helped do this, but Trump, and the minute I talked to him, he understood it. I said, you need to modify Make America Great Again to make America great again for all Americans. And now we got to mean it. And I think a campaign that was serious about that, and I'm happy to meet with the Black Lives Matter people. We may not agree entirely on detail, but I happen to think every American life matters, and I know that gets them excited, but I think it's true. And I think we ought to have a policy that says every American life matters, and that means you got to pay attention. We also have to look at, and I've been a significant leader in the criminal justice reform movement, 80% of the prisoners in some prisons are illiterate. Well, if we don't have some method of helping them learn how to read by the time they graduate, they get out of prison, why should we think they're going to have a job? Many of them are drug addicted. I just launched a project with Patrick Kennedy, working on opioid recovery. Because there are medications and things now that make it dramatically more likely you can help people lead complete lives even if they've been addicts. Yet we don't apply that in prison. One of the things I want to see done is a bill at the federal level. There's some states now which allow charter schools in prison, and they're actually having an effect. Well, why don't we do that at the federal level? Our goal ought to be that if you come into prison illiterate and drug addicted, you shouldn't leave prison illiterate and drug addicted. Now, that's a conversation I'm happy to have with any group in this country, and I think that puts me a lot further down the road towards real reform than some of the people who just jump up and yell racism.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, go back here. Yeah, that's great. Agree.
My name's Larry Gelman, and you point out the fact that Trump's numbers went up after he made comments that a lot of mainstream pundits thought were fatal for him. But his numbers went up inside the Republican Party and among Republican voters. We're now in a general election, and my question for you is, can a candidate win, and should a candidate win, when he makes statements that the Speaker of the House claims are textbook racist, and which you yourself said were inexcusable, and have raised questions about character and racism and so on and so forth, that a lot of Americans have a problem with?
Well, first of all, I've been pretty clear about my position on the use of ethnic terms to describe certain characteristics. And I thought it was particularly inappropriate when you're dealing with a judge who was born in Indiana, who worked as a prosecutor, and who at one point spent a year in hiding because the Mexican cartels wanted to kill him. So, there are places where people make mistakes. I would also tell you, I give Trump some slack for a practical reason. Prior to June of last year, he was a private citizen. I mean, he was a noisy, loudmouth, aggressive private citizen, but he would have told you the same thing. He was happily being who he was. He has had a big growth curve, but Clifton and I were with Attorney General Ed Meese the other day, and Meese had been with Reagan from the early governorship through the presidency. And we were talking about the fact that Reagan had, from the fall of 1965 to 1981, to think about the presidency. That's 16 years. Trump has barely had that many months. So he's going to make mistakes. That was a mistake. It was a stupid mistake. There's no evidence at all that Trump is a racist. In fact, if you go read The Art of the Comeback, you'll find out that Mar-a-Lago when he took it over, was specifically designed to be open to African Americans, to Jews, to anybody of any background, and he got in a huge fight with the city council because there are 2 clubs in Palm Beach that don't fit that. And he was quite clear with them. You deny me the right to open up this club, I'm going to file a civil rights lawsuit against the city. So there's no reason to believe, if you look at who he's been with, if you look at who he's used as entertainers, if you look at how he handled Miss Universe, if you look at The Apprentice, there's no reason to believe that he, in fact, is in any way a racist, but he at times says things. He's one of those people, again, as I said about Clinton earlier, he's one of those people who doesn't quite have a governor for the last 10%. You know, I mean, if he could get right up to the edge and then cut off the last 10%, he would be 3 times as effective a candidate, and he would probably be up by 15 points right now.
We didn't cover trade. We barely touched on education. I think you'll have to come back, and the Ideas Festival will have to be extended. I don't know what to do. I'll talk to Walter. The program that Newt, the speaker, has suggested he just started, which I read about with Patrick Kennedy, is #RecoveryNow. If you're interested in it, it's. I salute you again for another bipartisan initiative that's going to, I know, make results. Thank you immensely for being here.